That lemon grew in a pot, not a grove, not a garden bed, a container, on a patio, taking up a few square feet. A few pots over, the same variety of tree has never produced a single lemon. So what's actually different between them? It's almost never luck, and it's usually not the tree itself. Most beginners assume growing a lemon tree in a container just means putting it in some soil and watering it now and then. That one assumption is exactly what separates the tree that fruits from the tree that doesn't. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what makes that difference: the container, the soil, the light, the watering, and how to get a lemon tree growing the way the one you just saw did.
Direct sunlight.
If you've got a patio, a balcony, a sunny courtyard, or even just a bright spot by a back door, you already have enough space to grow a lemon tree. That's the real appeal of container growing. You're not waiting for the perfect backyard. You're working with what you've got and shaping the growing conditions yourself. This method works whether you're gardening in a warm coastal city or somewhere with real winters. The container is what makes that possible, because unlike a tree in the ground, a potted lemon tree can be moved into more sun, out of a heat wave, into shelter before a frost. This video is built for beginners. If you've never grown a fruit tree before, that's fine. Everything here is explained in plain terms, without assuming prior gardening experience. One honest note before we go further. This video won't hand you a guarantee of fruit by a certain month, and it won't pretend every lemon tree behaves identically. Climate, variety, and the age of the tree all play a role. What this video will give you is a clear, realistic understanding of the entire process, so you know exactly what you're working toward. This is the first video in a full lemon tree series, and each one builds on the last varieties. Planting timing, feeding, pruning, and troubleshooting are all coming up. Before we get into it, if you're planning to actually grow one of these trees, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now so you don't lose track of the next steps. And if this video's useful to you, drop a thumbs up. It's the single biggest thing that gets this in front of more people trying to figure out the same thing you are. Takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps. While you're at it, drop a comment about where you're growing yours. The climate differences come up a lot in this series, and it helps to know who's watching from where. Now, and this part matters more than most beginners realize. Let's actually answer the question everyone asks first. All right, let's get into it. Yes, a lemon tree can absolutely grow, flower, and produce fruit in a container. This isn't a workaround or a compromise. Citrus trees have been grown in pots for centuries, long before greenhouses and grow lights existed, because their root systems adapt well to confined spaces when the container gives them enough room. The advantage of a container is control. You control the soil. You control the drainage. You control how much sun the tree gets, and you can physically move the tree to protect it from extreme heat or cold. A tree in open ground doesn't give you any of that flexibility. There is a trade-off, though. A container limits how large the root system, and therefore the tree can eventually become. That's actually useful for most home growers, because a lemon tree left unrestricted in the ground can grow well beyond a manageable size. In a pot, the tree stays smaller and easier to maintain. This is why naturally compact or dwarf varieties tend to do especially well in containers. Their growth habit already suits a restricted root zone, so you're working with the tree's natural tendencies rather than against them. But here's the part beginners often miss. No lemon tree stays small forever just because it's in a pot. As the roots fill the available space, most trees eventually need to move into a larger container or have their roots trimmed back during repotting. A container doesn't freeze a tree at a fixed size. It slows and manages its growth. We're going to touch on choosing a tree in a moment, but the deeper comparison, which varieties are genuinely best suited to long-term container life, deserves its own dedicated look. That's exactly what episode 2 is for. If you're starting from scratch, you have two basic paths. Grow a lemon tree from seed, or start with a young nursery tree that's already grafted. Growing from seed can be a fun project, but it comes with a catch. A seed-grown lemon tree typically takes considerably longer to mature and begin fruiting, and it won't always grow true to the parent fruit. For a beginner who wants a realistic path to actual lemons, a grafted nursery tree is almost always the more practical choice. You'll usually be able to spot a grafted tree by a small bump or diagonal scar low on the trunk. That's the graft union, where a fruiting variety was joined onto a hardier root system. This combination gives you a tree that fruits sooner and often grows more predictably than one raised from seed. When you're at the nursery or shopping online, look for a few simple signs of a healthy young tree. The leaves should be a rich, even green, not pale, yellowing, or spotted. The trunk should be firm and upright, without soft or damaged bark. The roots shouldn't be circling tightly or bursting out of the drainage holes, and there shouldn't be any visible pests on the leaves or where the leaves meet the stem. Buy from a reputable nursery, whether that's a local grower or a well-reviewed online citrus specialist. A cheap tree from an unreliable source is one of the most common ways beginners set themselves up for problems before they've even planted anything. As for which specific variety to choose, that's a bigger question than this video has room for, and it's one that really depends on your climate and how much space you have. Episode 2 in this series is dedicated entirely to comparing the best container-friendly lemon varieties, so hold that thought. For now, what matters is this: a healthy, grafted young tree from a trustworthy source gives you the strongest possible starting point. The container is where a lot of beginners get tripped up, usually by going too small. A young lemon tree from a nursery is often sold in a container, somewhere around 3 to 7 gallons. Its first home in your care should generally be a step up from that, enough room for the roots to spread, without dropping a small tree into something enormous. An oversized container holds far more soil than the roots can use, and that extra soil tends to stay wet for too long, which is a real risk for citrus roots. A practical approach that several container citrus growers recommend is moving up gradually, one size larger at a time, rather than jumping straight to the biggest pot you can find. As the tree matures over the years, it will likely move through a few container sizes, eventually landing somewhere in the range of a 15 to 25-gallon pot for a mature dwarf tree. Drainage holes are non-negotiable. Lemon roots are extremely intolerant of sitting in water without free drainage. The roots can suffocate and begin to rot, even if you're watering correctly otherwise. If a pot you love doesn't have drainage holes, that's a problem to solve before you plant, not after. Material matters too, though less dramatically than drainage. Porous materials like terracotta or unglazed ceramic allow some moisture and air exchange through the walls of the pot, which many growers find forgiving for beginners. Plastic and glazed ceramic hold moisture longer, which can be an advantage in hot, dry climates, and a risk in cooler, damper ones. Dark-colored containers, left in strong sun, can also heat up considerably, which stresses roots worth keeping in mind if you're gardening somewhere with intense summer sun. One small but genuinely useful habit: raise the container slightly off the ground, on pot feet or a couple of bricks. It keeps the drainage holes clear and stops the base of the pot from sitting in a puddle after watering. Get the container right, and you've solved most of the drainage and root space problems before they can start. What goes inside that container is the next piece, and it's just as important. Lemon roots need two things that seem to pull in opposite directions: consistent moisture and constant access to air. That balance is really the entire goal of citrus soil. Ordinary garden soil is the wrong tool for this job. It's usually too dense for a container. It compacts over time, drains poorly, and can carry soil-borne pathogens that are far more of a risk in the enclosed environment of a pot than they'd be in open ground. What you want instead is a well-draining potting mix, either a commercial citrus or cactus blend, or a general potting mix amended with materials like perlite, coarse bark, or pumice to open up the structure. These additions create tiny air pockets throughout the soil, so water can pass through freely instead of pooling around the roots. A moderate amount of organic matter quality compost, for instance, helps feed the soil's biology and gives the mix some body. But this isn't a case of more is better. Heavy, waterlogged mixes are genuinely one of the fastest ways to damage a young citrus tree. So when in doubt, lean toward a lighter, more open mix rather than a dense one. If you're unsure where to start, a pre-made citrus or cactus potting mix from a garden center is a safe, well-tested option and a perfectly good choice for a beginner's first tree. With the right container and the right soil ready, there's really only one thing left before this tree has a permanent home: getting it into the ground correctly. That's a step where small mistakes can cause problems that don't show up for weeks. Here's the planting process, step by step. Start with the container prepared. Make sure the drainage holes are clear and add a shallow layer of your potting mix to the bottom, enough that when the tree's root ball sits on top of it, the top of that root ball will end up level with, or very slightly above, the rim of the surrounding soil. Gently remove the tree from its nursery pot. If the roots are tightly circling the outside of the root ball, loosen them lightly with your fingers. This encourages the roots to grow outward into the new soil rather than continuing to spiral. Position the tree in the center of the container. This is the step where beginners most often go wrong. Keep the root, flare the point where the trunk widens out into the roots right at, or just above, the soil surface. Burying that point too deep is one of the more common, slow-developing causes of a stressed or declining young citrus tree. Backfill around the root ball with your prepared potting mix, firming it gently as you go to eliminate large air pockets without compacting it heavily.
Dull, drooping leaves are a clear sign of a thirsty
right
plant.
After planting, until water runs freely from the drainage holes. This settles the soil around the roots and closes up any remaining air gaps. Let it drain completely. Don't let the pot sit in standing water. Afterward, tip out any that collects in a saucer. For the first few weeks after planting, the tree is focused on establishing new roots into the surrounding soil. During this period, keep it somewhere with bright light, but shelter from harsh, direct afternoon sun and strong wind. And check the soil moisture a little more frequently than you will once it's settled in. Avoid fertilizing right away. A newly planted tree's roots aren't ready for it yet, and we'll get to exactly when to start feeding shortly. Once the tree is planted and settling in, everything else comes down to 3 ongoing habits: light, water, and nutrition. Get comfortable with those 3, and you're doing most of what a container lemon tree actually needs. Lemon trees are sun-hungry plants. As a general guideline, most container citrus trees do best with somewhere around 6 to 8 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. Less than that, and you'll typically see slower growth, thinner foliage, and far fewer flowers when the tree reaches maturity.
Thrive in direct
Light
sunlight.
is one of the main inputs the tree converts into both growth
to see if it
and
needs
fruit.
water.
If you're growing indoors or somewhere with limited direct sun, position the tree at the brightest window you have south-facing in the northern hemisphere, and know that this is a topic we'll come back to with more detail later in the series. This is the section beginners most want a simple rule for, and it's exactly where a simple rule tends to fail them. There's no universal water every 3 days answer. Because how fast a container
Dull,
dries
drooping
out
leaves are a
depends
clear
on
sign of a
several
thirsty
things at
plant.
once.
Proper
The temperature, how much direct sun and wind the pot is exposed to, the size of the container relative to the tree, the time of year, and the structure of the soil itself. A small pot in full summer sun might need water every day or two. That same tree, in a larger pot during a mild spring, might go most of a week between waterings. The container size and the weather are doing more to set that schedule than any fixed calendar ever could. So, instead of counting days, check the soil directly. Push a finger a couple of inches into the mix. If it's dry at that depth, it's time to water thoroughly, until it runs from the drainage holes. If it's still moist, wait and check again in a day or two. Both directions of this can hurt the tree. Underwatering shows up as wilting, curling, or crisp leaf edges. Overwatering is often less obvious at first. It tends to show as dull, yellowing leaves and a general lack of vigor, because the roots are being deprived of oxygen even though there's plenty of water present. When in doubt, err very slightly on the drier side, rather than
Citrus
keeping
trees
the soil
thrive in direct
constantly
sunlight.
soaked.
They
A
require
container is a closed system. In open ground, tree roots can reach out for nutrients over a wide area in a pot. The tree only has what's in that soil, and regular watering gradually washes nutrients out through the drainage holes. That's why container-grown lemon trees need more consistent feeding than one growing in the ground. Use a fertilizer formulated specifically for citrus. These blends are built around the particular balance of nitrogen, along with the trace minerals like iron, zinc, and manganese that citrus trees are especially prone to running short on in a container. Follow the rate and timing on the product label, rather than guessing, and keep feeding mainly to the active growing season, easing off when the tree's growth naturally slows over winter. It's worth being clear about this. More fertilizer does not mean more fruit. Overfeeding can scorch roots, push out excessive leafy growth at the expense of flowering, and throw off the balance the tree actually needs. Consistent, correctly timed, balanced feeding beats a heavy hand every time. There's something genuinely satisfying about this rhythm once it clicks. Checking the soil, watching for new leaf growth, noticing the color deepen after a feeding. It stops feeling like a chore and starts feeling like paying attention to something that's responding to you. Light, water, and food are the daily relationship between you and the tree. Pruning is more occasional, but it still shapes how well that relationship pays off. For a young container lemon tree, pruning doesn't need to be complicated. At this stage, it's mostly about maintenance rather than shaping. Start by
Citrus
removing
trees
anything
thrive
dead,
in direct
damaged, or clearly
require
diseased. This keeps the tree's energy directed toward healthy growth instead of supporting parts that won't recover. Occasionally, you'll also see thin, weak, or awkwardly crossing shoots. Trimming these back keeps the canopy open, which helps light and air reach the inner branches. One thing worth watching for, on a grafted tree specifically, occasional shoots that sprout from below the graft union, from the rootstock rather than the fruiting variety above it. These are usually best removed since they won't produce the fruit you actually want and can drain energy from the rest of the tree. Beyond that, the main goal for a young tree is simply a manageable, open shape, not a heavily sculpted one. Avoid the temptation to prune hard or often. Excessive pruning removes growth the tree needs for photosynthesis, and on citrus, it can also remove wood that would otherwise have flowered. Timing matters too. Pruning during active spring growth tends to be gentler on the tree than pruning right before a period of stress, like the start of a cold snap. This is genuinely a case where less is more for a beginner. A light touch, done occasionally, is the full extent of what pruning needs to be at this stage. The more detailed shaping and fruit-focused pruning techniques belong later in this series. Once your tree is a little further along. With the tree planted, fed, watered, and lightly maintained, there's one question almost every beginner is really asking underneath all of this. When do I actually get lemons? This is the honest section, so let's be honest. Fruiting timelines vary a lot, and the single biggest factor is how the tree started its life. A tree grown from seed generally needs to pass through several years of pure juvenile growth before it's even capable of flowering. A grafted nursery tree skips most of that waiting period because it was joined onto wood that was already mature enough to flower, which is a large part of why grafted trees are the practical starting point for most beginners. Some lemon varieties can begin flowering within a couple of years of being planted as an already established young tree, though this varies with the individual tree and its growing conditions. Beyond the tree's age, flowering and fruiting depend on the same things we've already covered: consistent sunlight, balanced nutrition, and a generally healthy root system. A stressed tree, whether from too little light, poor watering, or nutrient gaps, will often delay flowering, even if it's technically old enough to fruit. It's also worth knowing that flowering doesn't automatically mean a heavy fruit set. Many citrus trees produce far more blossoms than they'll ever carry to maturity. The tree naturally sheds a portion of its flowers and small fruit, keeping only what it has the resources to properly develop. That's normal, not a failure. The right mindset for this first year or two is to prioritize a healthy, well-established tree over rushing toward fruit. A vigorous, properly cared for tree
press the
will get
surface
there,
to see if it needs
and when
water.
it does, the first lemon you pick from a tree you grew yourself in a pot on your own patio tends to taste a little better than the ones from the shop. That first harvest, however small, is genuinely worth the wait. Getting to that point, though, means avoiding the mistakes that quietly slow a lot of trees down before they ever get the chance. A handful of mistakes account for most of the problems beginners run into. None of them are complicated to avoid once you know what to look for. Poor drainage. A container without adequate drainage holes or one sitting in standing water sets a tree up for root problems from day one. Overwatering. Watering on a fixed schedule instead of checking the soil is one of the most common ways container citrus gets stressed. Too little sunlight. A tree tucked into a shady corner may survive, but it's unlikely to flower or fruit well. An unsuitable container, either far too small, restricting the roots too early, or so oversized that the soil stays wet for too long. Using heavy garden soil instead of a light, well-draining potting mix built for containers. Over-fertilizing. On the assumption that more feeding equals more fruit, it doesn't, and it can actively damage the roots. Pruning too hard or too often. Removing growth and flowering wood the tree needed. Ignoring temperature extremes, leaving a container exposed to a hard frost or to prolonged, intense heat without protection. Every one of these is avoidable, and now that you know what they look like,
press the surface
you're already
to see if it
ahead of
needs
where
water.
most beginners start. There's one more piece to this, and it's a big one for our audience specifically, because correct care doesn't look identical everywhere you might be watching from. Lemon trees are genuinely more climate sensitive than a lot of beginners expect, and this is one area where growing in a container gives you a real advantage. The tree isn't stuck wherever you first put it. In warmer climates, the main challenges shift toward the other end of the thermometer. Intense, prolonged heat-sustained stretches well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit can stress the tree, scorch leaves, and cause flowers or small fruit to drop. In these conditions, consistent watering becomes even more important, since containers dry out faster in high heat, and afternoon shade during the most extreme stretches can help protect a younger tree. In colder climates, frost is the real threat, and lemon trees are among the less cold-hardy citrus types. Even a short spell of freezing temperatures can damage leaves and young wood, and a harder, more prolonged freeze can kill the tree outright. This is exactly where a container earns its keep. When a hard frost is forecast, the tree can be moved somewhere protected, a garage, an enclosed porch, or indoors near a bright window until conditions improve. There's no single planting month or single temperature rule that applies to every gardener watching this. Whether you're in a mild coastal climate or somewhere with real winters, your local frost dates and seasonal patterns are what actually determine your timing. That's a big enough topic that it deserves its own full episode, with the actual temperature thresholds and planting windows laid out properly, rather than a rushed summary here. So here's where that leaves you. A lemon tree can absolutely thrive in a container, but it comes down to a handful of decisions done well. A healthy grafted tree from a good source, a container that's sized correctly with real drainage, a light and well-draining soil mix, planting done at the right depth, and then the ongoing rhythm of sunlight, careful watering, and balanced feeding. Get those right. Prune lightly. Protect the tree from real temperature extremes, and you've given it everything it needs to eventually flower and fruit. But there's one decision that can determine how well your lemon tree performs in a container before you even plant it: choosing the right variety. Not every lemon tree is built the same way for pot life. Some grow far more compactly than others. Some tolerate cooler temperatures noticeably better. Some fruit sooner. And some are simply easier for a first-time grower to keep alive. That comparison, which varieties actually make sense for your climate and your space, is exactly what Episode 2 covers. That's it for this one if it helped. The subscribe button and a thumbs up are right there. And Episode 2 is coming up next with the best lemon tree varieties for containers. Next up, the best lemon tree varieties for containers.